Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back for the session 4 on travel and connectivity across the seas. For this session, in chair we have Professor Michael Jansen. He's a professor at Rheinisch-Westfälische Technische Hochschule University, Aachen University, Muscat, Oman. He's joining us from Oman. Professor Jansen has been associated with UNESCO programs, and since 2002, he has been serving as technical expert, member of Bamiyan Working Group, UNESCO. In 2019, he has set up a research center for Mohenjo-Daro at Geopolitics, Muscat, Oman. Among the speakers, we have with us Professor Najaf Haider. Professor Haider is the professor at Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal University, New Delhi. Besides, we also have Professor Rila Mukherjee's paper. Professor Rila Mukherjee is the professor at Center for Historical Studies, University of Hyderabad. However, due to certain personal exigencies, Professor Rila Mukherjee is not been able to join us today. So on Professor Mukherjee's behalf, my colleague from ICWA, research fellow, Dr. Sankalp Gurjar will be reading out her paper. Before handing over the floor to the chair, may I now announce certain house rules for the webinar for this session. All the participants are requested to mute themselves when they're not talking. During the Q&A round, the chair and the moderator will take questions. Panelists and speakers can ask questions by unmuting themselves and raise hand option. The registered participants can ask questions live by typing through Q&A link or by raise hand option and unmuting themselves when their name is announced. These questions will be visible to all the panelists and speakers, and the chair or the moderator will pose the questions to the speaker concerned. With this, may I now invite Professor Michael Jansen to kindly conduct the proceedings for the session. Professor Jansen, over to you. Professor Jansen, please unmute yourself.
Okay.
Yes.
Now you speak. You hear me?
Yes, very well.
Thank you, Dr. Pragya, for handing over the chair. At first, let me give my thanks to the Indian Council of World Affairs and to Dr. Himanshu Pai for having invited me. It's a big pleasure and honor for us here from Oman to join this very important conference. And looking at the title, we are not so far away from you. Please let me introduce, in addition, I am not a sailor, I am an urban historian, and therefore, of course, the view from which we look at such projects like MAUSAM is also through the glasses of an urban historian. So the exciting aspect, and that is why you wanted to have multidisciplinarity, is that, of course, such a very precious jewel like MAUSAM is with many, many facets at which one can look from different points of view and which is reflecting its beauty into many, many, many directions. Therefore, I very much appreciate what has been set up to now, and I have to congratulate all my colleagues ahead who gave their contributions, which shows the enormous wisdom, but also the complexity of the topic you are dealing with. Still, but we may have chances also later when I give my presentation, I'm always looking and thinking about heritage, because my own center here, that is the Research Center Indian Ocean Heritage, which is placed at the German University of Technology here in Muscat, and we just have been officialized only a few months ago. Of course, this center is dealing also with heritage of the Indian Ocean. And as my colleague Schnepel said last year in a workshop we had here in Muscat on ports and transports in the Indian Ocean world, he commented that the term heritage is like a big bubble. You can put everything in it, and it is able to answer from each side you think of, whether it is social, economic, political, human, or whatever it is. And here we are in the problem to identify and to narrow down the approach towards what you want to do with Mausam. But I want to also thank Admiral Chauhan, who has been mentioned the Arabian Peninsula and even our projects. And here we see, for example, if I look from here, from Oman towards the Indian Ocean, that we have another view, another perspective. And so I think, and this is your aim, that the Indian Ocean is many, many people at the fringes, many civilizations, many different cultural approaches, but as I will show you tomorrow, in a spiral of time which goes up, with the important aspect of places, of ports where people live and where this transfer from land to water takes place with whatever we deal with. And now I want to come to our topic this afternoon, travel and connectivity across the seas. And I'm pleased to introduce our speakers, which have been already introduced by Dr. Pragya. The first one is dealing with the Mughals, and we know 1506, Kabul, Central Asia, where they came down to this rich land of the Indian subcontinent. And the Mughals primarily, as we all know, were fixed to the land side, but we will see today through the presentation of Professor Haider that, of course, many maritime aspects were involved, and that perhaps here and there, the image which is generally dealing with us has to be changed into more differentiated approaches. But we also know that at the edges, that means at the shores, rather soon, after 1497, after Vasco da Gama, Europeans settled down in Goa, Diu, at first the Portuguese, later the English, the French, the Dutch, and so on and so on. And they settled along the fringes of the land of the Indian subcontinent on the coasts. And it comes in a way as a surprise that the Mughal Empire did not really react in a hostile way. And we know from documents which we have translated from archives in Lisbon, Portuguese manuscripts, that, for example, from us, from South Oman, from Salalah, Al-Balid, Khorori, that, of course, there was horse trade to Saurashtra, Gujarat, also for the Mughals. That means, of course, their trade connections all around were quite active. So the second paper, and I'm thankful to Dr. Pravia that she announced that Professor Mukherjee is not giving her paper. It will be dealing with, allow me to cite her text herself, about South Asian cosmography to counter our notion of seascapes lying outside notions of sovereignty, territoriality, and technologies of control. Citation out of her paper. And what I understood in this abstract was that she wants to show that the imagination of India as a primarily land-oriented country should have more identity and memorizing their relations towards the Indian Ocean, towards the sea. And I mean, these were topics which we also saw in our previous presenters. And so here we are on the one side, the Mughals with their relation to the sea, and on the other side about imagination needs to think it over again, where India is in relation to where they want to go. And that is something which could be nice as a term with heritage. There are new words like heritageization, and we are memorizers, new terms in English, which I like very much, that with this heritageization, we are not only looking back, we are in the present, and we have to look into future heritage. So these are aspects which definitely could be very stimulating to discuss within the context of Mausam. But now I want to give the floor to Professor Mukherjee. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Professor Jansen. I will be reading out Professor Mukherjee's paper. The title is Studying the Asian Ocean Sea. This article urges a rethinking of South Asian cosmography to counter our conventional notion of seascapes, which are lying outside South Asian notions of space, sovereignty, territoriality, and technologies of control. The sea, having never really apparently featured as a source of social power, South Asia's idea of territoriality is seen to be land-based. This lack of visibility generates a maritime blindness, which affects policy formulation despite R.K. Mukherjee's work on seafaring, which traced diverse maritime perceptions from Pali and Sanskrit literature, from sculptures, coins, paintings, and epigraphy. By contrast, China's example as keeper of meticulous records pertaining to maritime matters shows attempts at actively controlling maritime spaces and provides new ways of reading South Asian perceptions of the sea. This presentation will highlight some transformative moments in changes in Indian perceptions of the sea and, taking examples from China, show how we might learn from China's historical experience of the sea. Part 1 of the paper deals with aims. This presentation has as its objectives correcting the maritime blindness that permeates Indian academia and policy formulation, as opposed to China's active engagement with the sea throughout its history. The examples that I provide from China's history show the Chinese state's attempts at actively controlling maritime spaces. These provide us with new ways of reading South Asian perceptions of the sea, as well as suggesting new research pathways. This research can focus on primarily two points: political and social geographies of the sea and tributary spaces. Let me explain it further. Political and social geographies of the seas does not just focus on economic geographies of maritime spaces. These new geographies can include seas in Indian political philosophy, as well as seas in regional geographies. It will also include a recording of all expressions relating to the sea in inscriptions. Second point, tributary space. Did this exist at all in India? In connection to this, we may focus on the following themes. The idea of control. The paper version of this presentation has shown that different expressions and different technologies of control existed in India and China in terms of awareness and mastery over sea space. Interstate relations. The nature of the Chinese state as a bureaucratic state, paper record state versus the more diffuse nature of the Indian state. Is the homogeneity we see in the nature of Chinese state and society an advantage? The role of single language versus multiple languages as they exist in India. A landscape of central places versus a landscape of central spaces. Mapping popular perceptions in terms of the location of caves, coastal shrines, and shore temples and mosques can provide us with alternative ways of reading coastal spatiality. Part 2. Is the maritime turn really a new phenomenon? While seas have emerged as central to economic and political security for most of the world's states, this is seen as a comparatively new phenomenon. Concerns such as understanding the nature of oceanic transits in order to establish strategic hubs, exercise control over sea lanes, fight rising sea levels, and tighten jurisdiction against smuggling, terrorism, piracy, and migration in the coastal belt are seemingly recent concerns. And this emphasis on the modern has resulted in a neglect of South Asia's rich tradition of maritime expressiveness. This presentation claims that waterscapes were not absent from Asian ideas of territoriality, but differentiating between awareness in literary expressions of political selfhood, wherein rulers saw the sea as boundary or even space of overlordship, and actual instances of ordering and controlling maritime spaces is important. To better appreciate the idea of control, China's perceptions of near and far seas, or the South Asian notion of coastal zone versus deep sea, can be referenced. China's near sea was not just physically close, it was a familiar coastal belt with multiple overlapping networks connecting to an imperial topos, that is, the capital. Did the same exist in India? South Asian territoriality, by contrast, was seemingly composed of sacred and agrarian power centers surrounded by ideologically construed empty spaces to be territorialized into civilization. While the sea was empty sea, the consensus is there was little need or incentive, despite a pull towards the coast, to territorialize it because it was so vast. According to India's historians, seas thus remained outside the technologies of control, which emerged only in the late 18th century, which became important in the 19th century and were refashioned in the post-colonial era. And India's history textbooks take this as the chief reason as to why European naval powers found it easy to make inroads into South Asia. But a careful reading of the epics present a somewhat different picture. The sea was still not familiar in Ramayana, but in 5th century Raghuvamsha, there are at least 17 passages dealing with direct experiences of seascapes. Buddha Vamsin's 5th century Sanskrit epic, Bruhat Katha Lokasangraha, a navigation chart that is rich in geographic reference from many parts of India and South Asia, has portions relating to sea voyages. In one, a hurricane blows a treasure ship off course to a mountainous land called Shrikunja. It's called as mythological home of demonic yakshas, basically. Prince Manohara, the poem's hero, learning of this mishap, notes down on a wooden board with a cover Samputaka details about the particular sea, direction, and place, orders a boat manned by an experienced sailor, and goes in search of that spot. Impelled by a favorable wind and in accordance with the marks and signs he had noted, Manohara reaches Shrikunja. Part 3, Defining South Asian Maritime Territoriality. Maritime territoriality in early South Asia was based not on law, but on an uncodified body of knowledge manifested in cosmic expressions. The cosmic realm saw an unnavigable ocean river stream surrounding the earth, within which continents floated. Oceans, rivers, and seas were seen as symbiotic elements of this natural world. Vedic god Varuna ruled heaven and earth as lord of light and time, commanding rivers, winds, and waves, and controlling the passage of ships across seas. Noted in Ashokan inscriptions, the notion of the all-encompassing ocean river was widely assumed by most post-Gupta dynasties and elaborated and systematized in subsequent centuries, when cities and states emerged and a reformed Vedic cult swept the subcontinent. Chandraketu Grahas, Kharoshti Brahmi ship seals, and Satvahanas double-masted ship coins nevertheless show a familiarity with the actual sea, and depictions of waterscapes in sculptures and paintings on temple walls, the churning of the ocean, and the nectar of immortality provided by the waters, the descent of the Ganga on earth, and her journey to meet the ocean. All of these underline a political vision of territory in an universal empire. Therefore, contrary to received history, a consciousness of space and sovereignty was implicit in formulaic expressions of seas as territorial limit. 1st century Satvahana king Gautamiputra Satkarni's dominions were called as bounded by the Arabian Sea, Bay of Bengal, and the Indian Ocean, are referenced as tasting the waters of 3 oceans, Ti Samudatoya Pativahana. 6th, 8th century inland Badami Chalukyas were lords of lands lying within 3 oceans. That's why they were called Tri Samudra Madhyavarti Bhuvana Mandaladhishwara. Sometime before 850, the Garuda pillar inscription claimed northern India, which is bound by Himalaya in the north, Vindhyas in the south, and the eastern and the western seas as tributary to Devapala. These seas also bounded later Chalukya king Vikramaditya IV's dominions. In the post-Gupta period, formulaic mentions of conquered lands in the claims of those who took the title of Digvijay, conqueror of the 4 quarters, also invoked space. This relationship between regions and larger entities changed as the peripheral or unknown became part of the mainstream. Territories subject to wider pools from Central Asia, from West Asia, and towards Southeast Asia emerged under new names. And ruling lineages were associated with territorial names rather than just clan names. Medieval inscriptions listed places of conquest. Later rulers paid more attention to describing the extent of territorial authority. Royal domains took on the appearance of demarcated territories, which were replete with physical boundaries and landmarks that served to make their extent, just as watercourses, hills, rock, outcrops, and named places had served earlier to mark granted land boundaries. How can we relate this new speciality to the sea? In this context, we need to ask certain questions. Why maritime knowledge accelerated in China as opposed to South Asia begs research. Different trajectories of knowledge production lie in the nature and administrative compulsions of the state, which has certain differentiations like centralization versus regionalization, centralized bureaucracy versus regional officialdom, and a single topos as imperial capital, with each place being defined through its distance to the central capital versus multiple overlapping places of significance, and the role of a single language in creating an unified body of geographical thought. Imperial fragmentation in South Asia encouraged vernacular regional geographies, which never attained the status of a meta-geography due to linguistic barriers, where the topos was cultural or religious rather than imperial, and where a small polity had no initiative to compile administrative documents into monographs which are suitable for a larger audience. This rhetoric often appeared in the Southern Song after moving south in 1127, when map guides were increasingly named gazetteers. The audience size for geographies was therefore very important. In China, imperial philosophy, seen in tributary and networked trade, as well as in its diplomatic cum military relations with the Asian world, dictated an active maritime engagement, which nurtured consistently active maritime perspectives manifesting in a single language over centuries. Constant restructuring of territory, calibrating the balance of power between court and region, between state and subjects, and territorial rejigging as the state's regional needs and political priorities changed, which saw China recording the management and defense of coastal belts, noting fortifications such as walls, forts, posts, bridges, and beacons. It is significant that each time piracy increased, and it did occur with regular frequency on the China coast, the state accelerated its knowledge production of the coast, advancing levels of geographical knowledge that was linked to active attempts at controlling maritime spaces, as seen in texts such as Zheng Ruzheng's Chohai Tubian. There may have been yet another reason as to why no traces of South Asian maritime perspective remain. Here, the nature of the colonial state versus the imperial state is focal. The heterogeneity of the Qing imperial elite led information to circulate in patterns distinct from those in European colonial empires. In addition to their loyal Manchu, Mongol, and Han bannermen, Qing rulers summoned to Beijing, permanently or in regular rotation, Chinese officials, Mongol princes, Tibetan Buddhist clerics, East Turkestani beygs, and Jesuit missionaries. This diverse elite was fragmented because of different bureaucratic career tracks, social circles, languages, religious and cultural perspectives, and educational backgrounds. Information commonplace to one group might be unknown to another. This is in contrast to the homogeneous circulation of information in British India, as described by C.A. Bailey, who, drawing on the work of Manuel Castells, argued that an information order connected the colonial states' surveillance agencies with autonomous networks of social communicators in Indian society. In this model, the most critical gaps in knowledge transmission were those separating from the political intelligence sought by the ruling elite and the indigenous knowledge of its subjects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gurjar, for the presentation of the paper of Professor Mukherjee. My question will be later. I think you will be probably not directly able to answer questions to this paper, or would you be willing to try to do it? Dr. Gurjar? Okay, we will see. At first, we want to go to the second presenter, Professor Haider. Please forgive me that I mixed up these sequences. Professor Haider is a professor of medieval history from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and he studied in Oxford, in Paris. He was in Europe very active, and he is very well known through lots of his papers. And he will be talking now about the presentation of the Indian Ocean in Mughal texts and miniatures. Professor Haider, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Jansen. I'm grateful to Professor Himanshu Prabhare for inviting me to participate in this very interesting conference, and also compelling me to think about a very little known theme, how the Mughals, and I'm using a very general term, Mughal emperors, princes, ruling classes, intellectuals, of which a very small sample is being presented here, how they visualized the Indian Ocean. The paper is divided into two parts. The first part is about texts, and the second is about visual material. The part on the textual evidence is itself divided rather superficially into 3-4 parts. Like the first is geographical, the second is commercial, the third is religious, in which one can include scholarship, religious scholarship, or one can treat it independently of religion, as I will explain later. I would like to begin with a very important quotation in the writings of the Mughal Emperor Akbar's biographer. He wrote the history of Akbar and his empire called Akbarnama, and the quotation is from the third part of the book, Ain-e-Akbari, which has a description of India, which he calls Hindustan. Ain-e-Ahwal-e Hindustan. And the quotation is before you: India or Hindustan is surrounded by sea on east, west, and south, but Sarandeep, Achin, Maluk, Malaga, and many islands are part of it. And the sea cannot demarcate its limits. In the north is a lofty mountain which stretches towards the territory of India on one side and of Central Asia and Iran on the other. Now, in this, we have perhaps the clearest notion of India as a geographical entity, and also as a peninsula, bounded on three sides by the Indian Ocean. And if you look at the map of the Mughal Empire, not at the time when Abul Fazl was writing, but at the turn of the century, you can see that a large part of the empire was under the had Indian Ocean as its frontier. It's also perhaps a prelude to the Mughal imperial ambition to convert a well-defined geographical entity with frontiers into a political entity. There is an understanding that not the whole of the country is under the Mughal rule, and perhaps there will be a time when it would be. The second interesting thing which Abul Fazl says is that even though the sea is a natural frontier, there are certain places like Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia which are part of the larger cultural nexus. I don't think Abul Fazl is implying that they are part of India politically, but that the sea does not prevent the Indian culture from reaching these islands or countries or regions, and one can perhaps think of, without using the term which the British did of Greater India, a larger cultural region. The third interesting thing, which is not here but in two letters which he wrote, one on behalf of the emperor, is the discussion of the Portuguese, who he says are now intruding into the maritime life of the region. The letter was written towards the end of the century, and the Portuguese were there from the beginning. So there is no particular hostility, as Professor Jansen said earlier, but now they are intruding. And it has been explained how they are intruding, and therefore His Majesty is trying personally to launch a campaign against them and drive them out of their islands. The term used is Jazair-e-Firang, or islands of the Franks, which is clearly a reference to places like Diu and Goa, which were under Portuguese occupation. So this is some kind of, if you like, an official or imperial intellectual understanding of the Indian Ocean as part of a larger understanding of India and its neighbors. Next, please. The second important level at which the Indian Ocean was visualized was trade. And about 80% of the Mughal foreign trade was oceanic. Only 20% took the caravan route to Central Asia and Iran and the Levant. Of the maritime part of Mughal India's foreign trade, the lion's share was taken by the Western Indian Ocean, particularly the Red Sea route and the Persian Gulf route. Mostly in Indian ships and Indian merchants, but an unquantifiable portion of the trade was also in the hands of foreign merchants, notably Iranian, Armenian, Turkish, Arab, and later, of course, European. Portuguese in the 16th century, English and the Dutch East India companies in the 17th, and later, of course, French and Danish. Of the commodities which India exported across the Indian Ocean, bulk of it was cotton textiles. I would say 90% in terms of value was cotton textiles. And it's very interesting to see, if you look at the manifest of a ship going to Mocha or Basra or Bandar Abbas, that fine cotton textiles woven in small towns and villages of what is today UP and Bihar, and of course northern Gujarat, were exported and used in a very large part of the world, both Middle East and Europe. Some of these textiles have Indian names like Rupak or Amriti from Amrit and Alacha. So there's a very interesting connection between the hinterland and the entrepôts, as well as the markets in which these textile, different kinds of textile material was used. Can I have the previous slide, please? Previous, please. The one you showed, yeah. The second one. Yeah. The second item was indigo, but I'm not going to talk about it. Of the commodities which India imported, once again, something like 80% was silver and gold, and the rest was horses, fine silk stuff, Chinese ceramic, coffee, Shiraz wine, and a whole host of other things which one might call trifle unless one is doing a micro study of these items. Next, please. The treasure was mostly gold and silver of Spanish-American mines in the 16th and 17th centuries. Of course, this trade was ancient from the time of the Roman Empire. And we have in the account of Pliny that he was bemoaning the loss of Roman gold to India for trifles. But what happened in the 16th century was the discovery of Spanish-American silver mines in Peru, Bolivia, and Mexico. And a large quantity of this silver came first to Seville and different parts of Europe, and then to India. And according to one calculation, 117 to 184 metric tons of silver was imported, which makes India at that time the largest recipient of European silver, and way ahead of China. Most of this silver came in coins, laris and reals of 8 or dollars or lion dollars, as you can see, but they also came in uncoined metal. Next, please. To give you a sense of a quantified sense of both India's magnitude of India's import of treasure, you can see that something like 80% at 3 different intervals, late 16th, early 17th, and second quarter of the 17th and last quarter of the 17th century. These three points yield us figures which are very significant for our understanding of how deeply India was connected with the Western Indian Ocean. Next, please. I think we missed one. Never mind. I would like to. I would invite your attention to the European contribution, which is much talked about because of the material that we have. We have plenty of material to study European trade compared to other, and that gives us some kind of a skewed view of European participation. You can see that the European participation was marginal in the entire period that we are talking about. It's only towards the end that the English and the Dutch increased their share to something like 20-25%, but throughout 75 or above was taken by sources which were Indian or Middle Eastern. Next, please. India also imported non-metallic currencies like cowries from Maldives, which circulated in Bengal, and bitter almonds, which were imported from Hormuz and circulated in Gujarat. These were used as small money in these two coastal regions, and sometimes also when there was a crisis of currency into inland interstices, commercial interstices. Next, please. From the silver that India imported, Mughal India produced its own coins. But the first ruler to mint a big silver coin called rupiah, from which we have the term rupee, was Sher Shah, the Afghan ruler, who first minted rupiah in 1540. I don't have 1540 specimen, this is 1541. And after that, of course, the Mughals followed and minted rupee in a very large number, which of course fueled the cycle of commerce. Next, please. The third important level at which the Indian Ocean was visualized was the Hajj pilgrimage. It was an annual affair. It was a big affair. It was particularly big when the season for Hajj coincided with the commercial season, that is the season of sailing of the sea. The two were based on lunar and solar and did not always go together. But when they did, there was a huge activity, particularly on the Western Indian Ocean. And one port, the port of Surat, was particularly known for sending ships to the two holy cities of Western Arabia or Hijaz, Mecca and Medina. And we are lucky to have this painting from a book written towards the end of the 17th century of Surat, where ships are sailing from the port to the Red Sea. You can see that between the ships and the fort of Surat, there is a river Tapti. Surat was not exactly located on the sea, but on the river, and it's a flat representation of the river and a flat representation of the various sizes of the ship. But it's very, very helpful not only in giving us a sense of the morphology of 17th century Surat, but also It's important. Surat was called Bandar-e Mubarak, or auspicious port, just because it also participated. Of course, its participation in oceanic commerce was far greater, but for this particular religious event, it earned a name. Next, please. If we can combine with Hajj the circulation of religious scholars who went from India to study in the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, we can have a rounded discussion of how religion contributed to the understanding of the Western Indian Ocean. But we can also discuss this as a separate theme, because many scholars went there not to perform Hajj, but only to learn. What they learn there is not quite clear to us, because Makkah and Medina were not great cities for scholarship. They were not like Damascus and Baghdad or Cairo, which were the real big centers. There were madrasas in these two cities, but they were not very well known. What I presume happened was that a large number of scholars came to the city, and this concourse allowed Indian scholars to meet, develop networks, and also spend time, particularly for those who overstayed. Next, please. Well, in the remainder of my time, I will show you a couple of paintings to give you a sense of how in an empire which was essentially a landlocked empire and which had central places inland, paintings show the sea. These paintings were mostly prepared in the imperial workshop. They were not meant for public viewing. They were a product of imperial and sub-imperial taste and style and preference. So it's more a reflection of how the elites visualize the Indian Ocean than how ordinary people looked at it. Next, please. Well, the first painting is an allegorical painting of Jahangir, the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, in which he is shown embracing the Iranian Safavid king Shah Abbas. The two emperors had never met. This is an allegorical imaginary painting. But what is important for us is the map. The two emperors are standing on a globe which has a map, and which by the standards of the time were was quite accurate. Next, please. A closer view of the map in which you can see the various cities, central places, Multan, Lahore, Delhi, Assam, Agra, Eastern Territories, Surat, Goa, Bijapur, Golconda, and of course, don't miss Ceylon, Sarandip, which is marked as such on the map which Abul Fazl was earlier talking about. Next, please. Well, the sea was also responsible for bringing the Europeans, as I argued earlier, and they developed a relationship, a very interesting relationship, which is still being discussed, and the jury is out on how important Europe was for the Mughals. But here I have put down three major themes. Christianity. The Mughals wanted to know Christianity not from Muslim scholars, but from Christians themselves. So they did not believe in having a knowledge of Christianity from Islam, Islamic Christianity. That's the reason why Christian scholars and Jesuit priests were invited. And of course, that opened a whole new world to the Mughals. Trade we have already discussed, in which they had fiscal interest, and of course, painting and map, of which you saw one. Next, please. Next, please. I don't think I have time for this. It's the painting of the conquest of Hooghly by Shah Jahan. This is my final slide and the final painting, which is again an allegorical painting. It is an illustration of the famous story of Alexander by Amir Khusro, a 14th century poet. The book was illustrated in Akbar's court in the 16th century. And this particular scene, which takes something like 40% of Khusro's book, just one scene is being illustrated here, and which is the lowering down of Alexander in a glass vessel, in a gigantic glass jar, into the Indian Ocean to study marine life. The point which I would like to make here is that unlike Khusro, who gives this whole incident a religious color, the Mughals and the Mughal paintings perhaps eschewed religion to a very large extent. And here, unlike Khusro, Akbar is trying to argue that Iskandar is not being sent diving into the deep sea to show his trust in God, but to show his curiosity to look into the abyss and see what the marine life was like. You will also notice that this painting has Indians and Europeans and not the classical audience of Khusro's Ain Iskandari. Thank you.
Mr. Jansen, just to interrupt before the Q&A, if there are any questions on Professor Rila Mukherjee's paper, Professor Himanshu Prabhare and Professor Madhuballa have very kindly agreed to take it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Yes, thanks to both papers, Professor Haider and that by Professor Mukherjee. What I found interesting is there seem to be different imaginations of water and ocean in the abstract, also religious thinking of Islam, perhaps also Christianity and Hinduism. Could there be a reason why, for example, in the depiction of the Mughal Empire,
as that city which was connected to the port in Sindh, Lahari Bandar, and since big ships could not sail from Lahari Bandar, from Lahore because it had a river, and Akbar wanted to build big ships because of the supply of timber in Lahore compared to Sindh. Sindh practically had no timber. So camels were built. And we have very interesting evidence of camels, like big boats on which the ship can be put, and then the ship can sail from shallow water into the deep water. We have also already seen the evidence of Surat, which again was a major entrepôt and was tightly controlled by the Mughal state through its governor in Surat and the Kiledar, or the fort commander. And that's why there is so much material on Surat. The Mughal emperor was interested in sending his own ship, particularly in the 17th century, to trade, including the ship of a Mughal princess, Jahanara, called Sahibi, which made so many trips to the Red Sea. So all this interest, religious, commercial, and political, combine into catapulting Surat into a big port.
Thank you very much. I think the floor is open now to the audience. I see Professor Himanshu lifting her hands. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Najaf, for that fascinating paper. I have two questions. One is, you talked about scholarly exchanges. Now, one of the things that I read in Professor Al-Habashi's paper was that Zabid in Yemen was a coastal center which had a university from the 13th to the 15th century. It's a World Heritage Site. And I was just wondering if we have connections to Zabid. And my second question is, I found it fascinating that while on the one hand, the Mughals are claiming parts of Sumatra, Malaya as part of the sea, 80% of their trade was the other direction. So how does one balance, that money was coming from somewhere else, but the claims were going somewhere else? Thank you.
I haven't come across the reference to Zabid as a major point of contact between Mughal religious scholars and the scholars in Yemen. Maybe because by then, by the, say, middle or end of the 16th century, that place may have lost its importance. Just as we know from a recent paper by Patrick Frank, which has come just in, very, very recently, that by the 18th century, the madrasas in the Hijaz were completely gone. Not that they were there in a big way anyway, but whatever influence or significance they had in the 17th century was practically gone, and Indian scholars, although they were going there, but their visit to these places was more inspired by religion or sanctity and gravity of the place, or rather a meeting point of scholars than academic or scholarly. So I think, and this is a theory, of course, one can always contest this, that my understanding is that Makkah and Medina are more highly religious places rather than scholarly places. The question which you asked about Ceylon and Achin and Malaysia, I think it's a very interesting question. I was also struggling with the passage, because the passage poses a paradox. On the one hand, it says that the Indian Ocean is India's frontier, very clearly. On the other, it says that even though it's India's frontier, it does not mean that these places are not part of India. So what does that mean? The sea, literally, the sea does not stop these places from becoming parts of India. Now, my interpretation is that he's talking about India's cultural influence. That culturally, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Malaysia are part of India, but not politically. Because, of course, they knew that the Mughal Empire had no ambition to cross the seas, and they had a different feeling about the Western Indian Ocean. They wanted to go there and drive the Portuguese out, which they couldn't, of course. I think they may have tried, but and have failed. But that's a counterfactual question. But the two perceptions are very different.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see Dr. TCA. I cannot see your full name. Please, the floor is yours. Please, the question. I see Dr. Ragan.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Haider, for a fascinating paper, because we don't normally discuss the maritime consciousness of the Mughals. So thank you very much for this. But my question was really related to some of the remarks you made. Yes, we know the Mughals had ports. Some of the Mughal nobles owned ships. The Hajj was very important. Trade was very important. We also know that they were in close contact with the Portuguese. We do, in fact, know that they deeply resented the Portuguese stranglehold over the Hajj and the misuse that was often put to. But putting all this together, do you find any kind of introspection in Mughal writings and commentaries about otherwise the reasons why a more fully developed maritime consciousness does not develop, does not emerge? Because we've been discussing in various ways about India's own continental focus, and that only recently we have tried to balance this by thinking more about the Western Indian Ocean and the Eastern Indian Ocean. But do you find any kind of introspection amongst the Mughals that there is something missing in their worldview in a political sense and in a military sense?
Yeah.
More than introspection, there's certainly they're paying attention whenever they can. So, I mean, I mentioned how big ships were built in Lahore and through Ravi came to, and Akbar personally, when he made Lahore his capital, personally supervised all these operations. But there's certainly an evolution. In the 1640s, we see a certain surge in Indian shipping, so much so that it alerted both the Dutch and the English East India companies, and there's a lot of documentation on that. Of course, there is some documentation in Persian also, but we know this from the reactions of the two commercial companies, that now more ships, more Indian ships, particularly ships of the Mughal king Shah Jahan, but also of Mughal merchants. And shippers are going to the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, and this has threatened our business, particularly our business of carrying cargo and renting out cargo space. This is a very important moment, and this has something to do with shipbuilding technology and availability of timber. So there is certainly a very strong interest, which is somewhat inhibited by the use of technology. Of course, Indian ships were technologically no match to European ships. You just have to look at the rates of insurance premium of Mughal ships and European ships. European ships carry very low insurance, and merchants would like to rent there. But this monopoly is broken in the second half of the 17th century, and this continues in Aurangzeb's period also, when there is English piracy in the Western Indian Ocean and a lot of collaboration between the Mughals and the Dutch. To perhaps at this moment, there may have been some introspection, if you like. One really has to examine the sources of this time to see in, for an emperor who has conquered a large part, as we saw on the map, of the South Asian territorial nexus, had very little control over the sea and had to ask help from the Dutch to protect Indian ships from English piracy.
Yeah. Are there more questions? Yeah, what I think very interesting, if we maybe complete with this, the Mughal discussion, Lahore was not from the river system, the one connected to the Indus. It goes to the Ganges. And I mean, this was definitely one of the very clever tricks of the British. The first they did, they conquered the mouth of the Ganges with Calcutta and controlled as such the whole waterway hinterland of the Mughals. But the Indus system itself never really, Shah Jahan was in Tata, but they never really exploited this system for seafaring, or, as you also rightly said, I think not really developing attempts and aggressivity to conquer outside the land. And so I think, in a way, they had a land thinking developed from Afghanistan, from Central Asia since long, and kept this conception more important than going abroad like the Portuguese did and the Spanish and whoever wanted to move out. But we have no indication. What about Baroda and Surat? They were harbors, which we know from the Portuguese manuscripts, that they were harbors which dealt with Oman, for example, but they were not direct.
Cambay was a very important harbor, and it was only after Cambay declined that Surat emerged as a major entrepot.
Yes. Okay, what is our timing? We are.
May I interrupt to say that there are a few questions coming in from the Q&A chat box?
Do I have to look at the writings? Is that correct?
Yes, no. Yes, that's right.
But the last I see is to ADM Chauhan. It's no question now for this session.
I'll read it out. There is one question by Dr. Stuti Banerjee. She asked that question to Professor, any of the panelists, to you actually it is directed, and she is asking, has your research led to evidence of a port apart from Lothal and the possibility of extensive sea trade during this period of Mohenjo-daro? That is directed to
me.
Yes.
Oh, I'm very happy to be asked about that. I had no real chance to say we have very recent, lot of research in this respect. And I have to admit, at the moment, we are even talking about the revolution of transport, where with Lothal and, of course, also the ports of the Indus Valley, we have clear indications for first interregional sea trade, maritime trade. And I told you we have in Oman now Dahwa, and in Salud we have Indo-Seals. And of course, we have reports starting already with Marshall, 1924-25, connections with Mesopotamia and Bahrain. So I think that was the first starting of maritime trade, if we do not into account the Austrasian movements in the East Indian Ocean, but that's a different story.
There is another question, hand raise I can see from the attendees. Mr. Mukesh Sharma, you can please unmute yourself and ask your question. He's not asking. Okay, so I think we have lost him. He's not there. There's a hand raise from Commodore Odekal Johnson as well. So Commander Johnson, please ask your question.
Thank you. My question on the same, the interest of the Mughal rulership to maritime strategy. And there has been mention of the Sindhu, the Surat on the west. Question is there more clear evidence of what is sometimes called naval operations in the Brahmaputra? And there is some scholarship about even as early as Akbar about some construction and certain sea battles. Would that bring in some riverine components of naval operations in the Mughal?
See, this is one of the quirky thing about history is that more documentation is produced when there is a war or there is a departure from normal life. So the largest corpus of literature that we have about Mughal naval activities in the Brahmaputra comes from Mir Jumla's invasion of Assam. And of course the whole thing began with Akbar, but Akbar was more interested in alliances and not crossing the line. But in Aurangzeb's period, of course, there was a full campaign with ships and gunboats and artillery. Of course, the mainstay of the Mughal military force was cavalry, but in this case, we clearly see how they employed the other parts of their army. And this whole battle has been reported by an eyewitness who was sent by the king to record the event, a news reporter. So we are lucky to have that report, which is not only about the battle itself, but also about the region and the people of the region. It's about Assam. And that gives us a lot of information, and really, it's a valuable piece of information for anyone who wants to look at how outsiders look at. The Mughal news writer was an outsider in Assam, and how he looks at them and how the campaign was conducted.
Thank you.
Very much. Commander. If there is no more question, Dr. Pragya.
Professor Jansen, just to interrupt, there was a hand raised by Commander R.S. Vasan few minutes back. So if he's here.
Yeah, please. I didn't see
Commander R.S. Vasan, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
I think two questions before me have already asked the same question. This was about the importance of the sea for Mughals to continue their empire. Obviously, it is the weakness at sea that resulted in subjugation to the colonial empire thereafter. This point has come out even earlier, but it was also brought out by Oracle that there's not much recorded history on what happened on the eastern side. Obviously, maybe because of the proximity of Mecca and the desire to connect with the Arab community on the Western Arabian Sea, that prompted them to emphasize only to a certain extent in terms of connection. So there were no large fleets, and this is perhaps the reason why they lost out their empire. That is recorded history. But any particular reason why they have this kind of a attitude to be land-oriented?
Dr. Pragya, I did not understand. I'm sorry.
The audio, there's a problem with the audio.
Yes, the microphone is not working properly.
Yeah. You wanted to ask again? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, sir. This is better.
Is it better?
Yeah.
Much better. All right. Okay. No, I think the question is related to what Ambassador Raghavan had asked earlier, and also what was brought out by Commodore Oracle. The point is that it's very clear that there was a certain amount of reluctance to engage in big fleets. This is from the Mughals. The smaller ships that you are talking about is all fine. But more of this was related to their, journey over the sea for, connecting with the Arab countries and for a limited trade from, as you brought out, from Lahore or Surat or other places. There's not similar evidence on the eastern side. So this is a major point. Though, again, Commodore Jansen spoke about Brahmaputra. There's not much that is there in terms of maritime warfare abilities of the Mughal, which is what led to their decline, which is understood. So, we also perhaps carried that legacy and we continue to accuse our government of being ocean blind. So, any comments on why the Mughals ignored the sea to such an extent that it led to their demise?
No, the sea was not responsible for their demise. There are theories of the decline of the Mughal Empire, and the Indian Ocean is yet to figure in that. So, but yes, I would agree with you that technology was a major. And the Mughal ships were very big. Some big Mughal ships were like 1,000-ton. So these are not small ships by the standard of the Western Indian Ocean traffic. So these are big ships which we are talking, carrying passengers, carrying merchants, and a large amount of cargo of textile and sugar and spices and saltpeter. So these are big ships. But if you compare Mughal naval technology or ability to European, of course, there is no comparison. I would say not even with the Chinese. And that is simply because technology transmission was not taking on in the same way as it was taking in other parts of the world. Mechanization was not considered to be and I can give you a very small example. When a printed book was presented to the Mughal Emperor Akbar, he was not very happy because he said, my scribes can make a very beautiful, delicate book, and this is so ugly. So you can see in this remark a certain cultural inferiority towards mechanization and technology transmission. And you can draw analogy, Indian military technology, and I would include inland warfare also. In that a large number of artillerymen were Europeans. And India, of course, we know that Mughals did not have the technology to forge large cannons. And they had to work with small cannons on wheels. So technology, I think, is a very, very important, but to use modern sensibilities and to think about the Mughal mind, I think that will be a mistake. They are happy in the country that they are, and it's a very large country. And the Mughals were traveling like anything from one part of the country to another. So it is not entirely fair to draw them out into the sea because they are fully occupied on land.
Professor Haider, thank you very much. Dr. Pragya, do we have still some time? I'm 1.5 hours ahead, so
Yes, we can take one last question maybe.
Fine. Is there any? You have better overview than me.
Sir, I can see Dr. Athar Jafar has raised a hand. So please ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Pragya, and thank you, Chair. This is for Professor Najaf. I want to know whether the Mughal court was aware of the discoveries being made. For example, the New World, America was discovered, or the expeditions being sent by the rulers in Portugal and Spain. So, was the Mughal court aware of it, these discoveries and these expeditions, and what was the response? Was there any response to these from the court? Thank you.
So they were, of course, aware of the discovery because there was a lot of information that was coming from Europe. The Jesuits, of course, were one who came to Akbar's court, and before them also there were stray scholars and visitors. So they knew. The Abul Fazl uses the term Dunya now, which is the New World, for New World or America, and they also knew that silver and gold is coming from the mines of Central America in the coins, because a lot of coins were minted in Mexico, and Mexico was the local mint name was written on the real of 8. So of course they knew that the treasure which they are getting, particularly silver, earlier gold, but from the middle of the 16th century, silver is coming from the mines of Spanish mines and coming first to Europe and then to India. They also knew that there was a Manila galleon of ships sailing from Acapulco to Manila carrying silver, which came to China, and of course a part of it to so insofar as the knowledge of the wider world was concerned, the basic knowledge was there. Of course, they were not curious about everything as we are today. They were only curious about certain things which aroused their curiosity. And as I said, painting is a very, very major area of curiosity. In fact, there is a remark made that only European painters were capable of painting abstract themes. Indian painters weren't. So, allegorical, the whole idea of allegorical painting, the tradition of allegorical painting owes its origin to, by their own admission, to European painters. So their curiosity was of their own kind. We can't really, again, use our modern thinking to say that why they were not interested in this. Of course, counterfactual history also leads to a better understanding of what exists. But there are such Christianity, as I said, they were very keen to, particularly Akbar and Jahangir were very keen to know about Christianity, not as understood in Islam, but as believed and understood by Christians themselves. So Akbar wanted books on Christianity written by Christian scholars and translated into Persian, and some were actually translated. So we can map the various areas of knowledge which animated their minds but not everything was of importance to them.
Yeah, I think we
One
can.
more questions. Was it the last one?
One last question, quick question from Dr. Vivek Mishra.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very small question. I think most of my concerns have been answered in Commodore Wasson's question. This is to Professor Najaf. If there was one book that you would recommend for Indian Ocean strategic history, what would it be?
Well, unfortunately, we don't use the term strategic.
Precisely.
We don't. This is a modern term which has come out as part of our understanding of modern military technology and surveillance and mapping of geographical regions, both cartographically as well as academically. So we have books on the various aspects of Professor Himanshu Prabhare edited a book on the Indian Ocean with Edward Alpers, and I have contributed a chapter to the book. There's a book by Michael Pearson on the Indian Ocean, which is also very good. K.N. Chaudhary's classic book on the English East India Company, the trading world of Asia and English East India Company, which had a follow-up on, I can't remember the name of the book. I think it's called Trade and Civilization Since the Rise of Islam, but it's a cultural history of the Indian Ocean. It's a slim book, unlike his previous books, which are fat volumes. This is a slim book. So there are 4 or 5 books which give us the Indian Ocean is a very large area, and there are many themes that people and more themes are coming up. So it's very difficult to read them all. For us Mughal historians of the Mughal Empire, we are not so much interested in military or geopolitical aspects. We are interested in political, cultural, and commercial, and of course religious as well. So these are our concerns, and my readings are mostly based on these concerns. But these are 4 or 5 scholars who have done very well in the field.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Maybe I conclude. I think what we also learned in this session is that we cannot anticipate that even in a subcontinent like India, that there is a homogeneous relation towards Indian Ocean. Coastal people will have a different relation than the inland people. I may compare to Oman. You can imagine that a Bidu in the Rubba Khali never has seen the ocean and also is not very much interested, while the coastal people already are quite different from the oasis people. So for the Mughal Empire, of course, strategically, the center had to be interested in the exchange, in the economy, but obviously not in foreign policies to execute and to use a machinery like war boats to conquer something outside. At least this is not known to me. This would also combine us to the paper of Professor Mukherjee, because if there is an understatement and understanding in relation to the Indian Ocean, also to China, we should differentiate of which group of people or which subdivision we are talking about. And definitely, we cannot anticipate that countries like China or India would have had a common thinking about something like the Indian Ocean. That's why I was asking in relation to the religion of Hinduism, where the ocean in the philosophy, in the tales and whatever it is, has another meaning as it has in Islam. I do not know major stories talking about the ocean as something very important. The same in Christianity. So that could be a reason why memorizing and heritageization has to be looked at different levels from subunits to evaluate, and we cannot just generalize everything in one. So thank you. If you accept with my last statement, I would thank you all for your very exciting contributions. And I give the chair back to Dr. Pragya, and thank you for having been with me for these 2 papers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jansen, and thank you, Professor Najaf Haider. We'll now close this session, and we'll take a very short break of a few minutes, and we'll reconvene with the panel discussion on Project Mausam at 5 p.m. sharp.
Thank you.
5 o'clock, yeah.
5 minutes.